So we were talking about Bhagwati and Panagariya's article on multitude of labor reforms, labor laws and their reform. So basically the authors are saying that we have not been able to achieve a transformation in our economy, and that transformation is on three accounts. Transformation of workers from the agrarian sector to industrial sector, we have not been able to achieve that, which is also reflected in the fact that we have a huge bulk of our workforce in the agrarian sector, the quantum being somewhere around 47%. Then in terms of formalization, again, we've already discussed in the previous session that the quantum of formal sector is just 10% of our overall workforce. That increase in formalization has also something that has hindered the transformation in the Indian economy. And in terms of urbanization, our pace of urbanization is extremely slow, and in the last 70 odd years we have just been able to achieve an urbanization of 31%. This is the 2011 census, but still this definition of urbanization that we have said, which is 31%, is extremely broad. So in terms of a narrow definition, our urbanization is even smaller. So the authors have kind of focused on there and put their lens on labor reforms and labor laws as a major underpinning for our lack of transformation. So the authors say that while in 1991 we took we underwent what is called as Big Bang reforms. So the first reform process, if you have to probably suggest, is somewhere around 1950s, 1960s, where we put the economies, where we put the public sector on the commanding positions. Something that we had learnt in the previous semester, that in the era of Nehru and in the era of pre Rajiv Gandhi, we had put all these public sector enterprises on commanding heights of the economy. Then the major reform came in 1991, where we introduced the serum of new liberal reforms in terms of liberalization, privatization and globalization. However, these reforms that we had done were majorly targeted towards the product market, the end product market. We were allowing public sector, we were allowing the private sector to make products in the public sector. To give you a small example, basically saying that now you can have private entities operating in the market. I mean, it will not just be reserved for the public sector. So as I was saying that this was the case in at time of 1991. We had opened our product market, but what goes into the product market is the factor market, and that is more inherent nature of the economy, and it's something like you're changing the surface of an economy without changing the underlying conditions. The underlying conditions is basically something like a derivative, that the economy is basically getting its product from these factors, and you're not changing these rigid factors. So that was one of the problems, because of which we were not able to see the kind of transformation in the economy which China did. So China became an industrial economy, and China started growing at around 10% per annum for the next 30 years after it introduced its reforms in 1978. Whereas we did not see a commensurate increase in our growth rate, except for a small period between 2003 and 2008, which is also called as the golden phase. Now, if we talk about factor markets, the problem becomes that in terms of constitutionality, not everything is with the center. For example, land is a subject which resides in the pockets of the states. Similarly, labor is an area which is in the concurrent list. Capital is a very broad area. Then you have something like agriculture, which needs to be reformed. Again, it's under the fiefdom of the states. So given the federal structure of the government of India, or given the federal structure that Indian democracy is, the kind of reforms are going to take place in a slow manner, in a very how do I define it? the exercise has to be very consultative. So you cannot imagine a transformation, an overnight transformation that happened in China to be replicated in a country like India. However, after the government that was formed in 2014, NDA 1, the government has taken a number of steps towards reforming the factor markets. Some of them it has met with a lot of resistance. For example, land reforms, it met with a lot of resistance. Farm reforms, it's meeting a lot of resistance right now. Labor, again, it's going to meet a lot of resistance. It's kind of a clash between civilizations. One side believes that okay, the state should have a welfare objective and state should be there in terms of employment and in all these sectors. Whereas the neoliberal phenomena believes that okay, everything which is inefficient should be left to the market and the state should concentrate only on its core activities. So you have two different thought processes and two different ideologies in terms of economics clashing each other. Then we had discussed something with respect to Leontief paradox, and the reason that we discussed Leontief paradox was because of the fact that this is what is also being reflected in terms of India's export market. Let's quickly recap of what we had done. So we had talked about that there's a flight of capitalists from the Indian market. So the Indian entrepreneur does not want to hire from the labor market. The first reason being a very slow growth in the manufacturing. As I told you earlier as well, in 1990 the share of manufacturing in the Indian GDP was just 16%, and in 2019 2020 as well, if you can probably change it to 2021 as well. In 2021 also, this is somewhere around 16 to 17%. So Indian manufacturing has not taken up. It is also called at times that India has missed the manufacturing bus. It's also called as missing the manufacturing bus. Then the other factor is that we have a very poor performance of our labor intensive manufacturing. Now, when we talk about labor intensive manufacturing, we see that what is the share of labor intensive manufacturing in our overall organized sector. So labor intensive manufacturing is basically those industries where the capital by labor ratio is very skewed in terms of labor. So something like textiles, something like handicraft, something like a leather product industry. So these, or a shoe industry, or any kind of a textile. Take the case of carpet weaving. So all these industries are typified in terms of a labor intensive industry, because the extent, when you compare the K by L ratio of these industries, this should be much more skewed towards hiring more of labor as compared to capital. But and that is what India's advantage should be, which is what Heckscher-Ohlin also postulates in their theorem of factor abundance, and in terms of the theorem is also called, the theorem which we have explained here is basically also the factor abundance theorem, which talks about that which country will export what kind of a commodity. So the reason that Heckscher-Ohlin theorem is so famous, because given its assumptions, it explains the kind of export and import pattern a country should emit. Now, if we see, then our expectation should be that we should be exporting a lot of labor intensive products, whereas if we see the share of labor intensive industries in overall organized sector, that is stagnant at 13% from 1990 till 2004. And even post 2004, although the data is not given with us, but we know that post 2004, the industries in the organized sector which have done the best are industries like the pharmaceutical industry, industries like the automobile industry, both of them being capital intensive industries. So in all, we can say that in the Indian labor market, we've not been able to diversify our manufacturing more towards the labor intensive industries. Then the other point that was covered was in terms of composition of exports. In terms of compositions of exports, in 1990, the share of capital intensive products in our export basket was somewhere around 41%, whereas when we talk about the year 2007, the share of these capital intensive industries has even increased even further, which is somewhere around 65%, which basically shows that we are kind of reflecting what is typified by Leontief paradox. So that is another issue. And why is that? That is because of the fact that Indian manufacturers have shifted to basically labor saving techniques of production or capital intensive techniques of production, even though the industry overall might be a labor intensive industry. But the entrepreneurs have chosen to hire less labor and hire more capital to basically get rid of all those labor problems that we had discussed. So essentially what we are seeing is that in the production of all commodities, we see that overall our manufacturing or overall our products are becoming more capital intensive as compared to more labor intensive, thereby going directly against what is being postulated by Hector Olin in terms of our comparative advantage. Then, one of the issues that is also discussed is the farm size distribution. There are a couple of authors here to be mentioned. One is Mazumdar and Sarkar, the other is Hassan and Jandak. Now, what these authors say is that there is something called the missing middle in case of India, that India has a huge overwhelming share of small firms in its manufacturing. So if you see apparel manufacturing, then less than 8 workers employ 80% of all the micro enterprises in apparel manufacturing. And if we talk about overall labor intensive manufacturing, if you see firms employing less than 49 workers, they contribute towards 93% of the overall manufacturing. So overall what you need to see is that the distribution of our so if we see the distribution of our firms are highly skewed in favor of very small industry. So if you were to draw a bar graph, then you will see that 0 to 9, 0 to 10 worker firms are extremely large, and then you have 400 plus large firms, enterprises which are hiring more than 400 workers. That is also significant, but the range between these two is extremely small, which shows that you don't have firms which are employing a lot of people. Again, that signifies that our share in manufacturing is low. This also signifies that we have not been able to pull people from agriculture to the industrial sector, which also is reflected by a poor share of employment in the manufacturing sector. Now, then we went on to the neglect of labor and land market reforms, and we basically said that while in 1991 a lot of reforms were taken, all of those reforms were primarily based on your product market, and the labor market reforms were perhaps shelved or not taken up. To be taken up last year, when you have converted all your labor codes, all your central labor codes into 4 codes. Then after that, we had discussed certain laws. These are important central laws which actually hinder employment in our manufacturing and employment in the organized sector. So we had talked about 5 or 6 of them. Let's quickly review all of these laws. The first law was the Trade Unions Act 1926. Now what this act says is that if you are an employer and you have 7 or more workers in your firm, then these workers would be allowed to form a trade union. And once a trade union is formed, then they have a power to strike, they have a power to bring the employer to labor courts in case of a dispute with the employer. So what it in general encourages is that the entrepreneurial thing, that let me not hire more than 7 people, because just in case these workers gang up against me, I will be dragged to court. Instead of me working on the shop on the shop floor of the factory, I'll be visiting more often to the labor courts. So again, this kind of promotes micro enterprises, and the distribution is being skewed towards micro enterprises because of this law. Then coming to the second law, which is the Employee State Insurance Act 1948, it says that factory employees which employs more than 10 workers, and basically workers which get less than 10,000 rupees, it's applicable to those employers, and these employers should give sickness leaves, medical leaves, then maternity leaves, injury benefits. All of these benefits should be given to the employer if they are hiring more than 10 workers. Again, so what essentially it kind of signals, so these are kind of signals that are being given to the employer. So it kind of signals a power signal to the employer that, okay, do not hire more than 10 workers. Then the third act that we had considered was the Factories Act, which is again relevant for manufacturing, organized manufacturing sector, having more than 10 workers with power. And this act suggests that the maximum number of working hours is 48, and it also restricts 48 per week, guys. Just a second, 48 per week. And the maximum amount that women can work is 9 hours, and their working hours is also fixed between 7 p.m. to 6. They're not allowed to work between 7 p.m. to 6 a.m. So essentially, apart from that, there are a number of things that the Factories Act also suggests, that you should have a water cooler, you should have separate canteens, the sanitation of those canteens. So all of this produces a lot of paperwork. So the compliance cost, it's not as if that's difficult. The problem is the compliance cost. The compliance cost of these acts is huge. The compliance cost is a major problem. Especially if the entrepreneur is a small entrepreneur and without much of knowledge in terms of details of how the functioning of these forms and how to do the due diligence happen. They don't know how to follow the due diligence in terms of labor laws. So that becomes a huge problem. Then you have another act, which is the Industrial Dispute Act, which is the king of all the acts, and it applies to all industries irrespective of their size. And what it says is that it says that you have to take the permission of the state government before retrenchment or firing of a single employee if you have more than 100 workers. So that basically restricts the hire and fire policy which an employer can possibly have if it finds an employee which is inefficient. So this act basically increases a lot of rigidity in terms of hiring and firing, and that is why one of the issues which is being resolved in the labor courts is this particular act. Then the last act is the Contract Labours Act 1970, which talks about that to get rid of all the problems with respect to employer and employee. What the employer does is that it hires a contractor, and the contractor has basically a contract with the employee, and what it does is that it kind of protects the employer from all of these liabilities that might arise. So essentially that is what is also being happening in the Indian economy. We'll see that through data today, whereby I'll show you that in the Indian economy we have a huge surge of unorganized and in the organized sector, but the problem is that these are coming from the informal sector. So let's see that first, and then we can take it off. this is the other reading that we'll be covering today. So if you see this, this is something that we also did in the previous semester. That what we have, this data by the way is not given in your reading, so you can probably take it down or you can probably note it. So what we have is that the share of, if you see the share of informal sector, and within the informal sector what is happening is this share is increasing. Your informal organized is increasing, and the reason the informal organized is increasing is that you're pulling people from the unorganized informal, you're pulling people from the organized informal to organized, sorry, you're pulling people from unorganized informal to organized informal, whereby these are people with contracts. Ideally you should add more people to formal organized, you should add more people here, but instead of adding more people here, you're adding more people in the organized informal sector. Why? Because now, for example, Delhi Metro is hiring a lot of people, but Delhi Metro is hiring these on the daily wage level. So that becomes hiring in terms of contracts. So as I gave you the example of drivers in ministries, of sweepers in ministries, or the security agency now being contracted out in almost all the ministries, or not in all not in ministries, but in these colleges. So all of that shows that there is a huge surge in contractualization in the Indian economy. Let's talk about the debate, which is the most important part. And after we do this debate, we can, or let me do this debate through the reading first, and then we can probably talk about the other reading. Give me a moment. So first of all, this is where the question actually will arise. This is an important part of the reading where the questions will come from. And this being a very important, very lengthy reading, and also associated with another reading combined with it, which is the Achin Chakrabarti reading. This basically, these two readings comprise of somewhere around 50-60 pages of your overall syllabus. So you should lay a lot of emphasis on this. And then there are again a couple of readings in agriculture, which Achha, that reminds me, guys, what is Garima doing in the course? Can someone give me an update? What are you covering? What topics are you covering? Are you covering foreign trade with her? Guys, hello.
Sir, we are covering
Industrial performance.
Industrial reforms.
Hold on. Why are you doing industrial reforms? What reading are you covering there?
Sir, G. Dennis Rajakumar. Size and growth of private corporate sector.
No, these are your readings. Can you see the page? These are your readings. Which reading is she covering? Muskan?
Sir, इनमें से तो नहीं है. Manufacturing की reading है. Size and growth of private corporate sector.
ऐसा तो syllabus में कोई reading ही नहीं है. Okay. Basically, these two readings have to be done. Reading 3 and reading 4. And probably one of the readings in services. Chalo, well, I'll speak to her regarding this. Have you covered services with her? Like, guys, yes or no?
No, sir.
But this is your syllabus, guys. I don't think there's any reading by that name. So I'll probably get back to her regarding this. So let's quickly go through the debate. This is a debate which is going to be extremely important because your questions will be framed on these on this particular debate only. Okay. So your questions often come from this debate. So you need to have a very good grasp of what is being argued and what is being counter argued. Now think of it as a debate between two sides. Now what are these two sides? I'll first go through the class notes, and then I'll go through the reading as well. Now there is one set of people who are called the skeptics. These skeptics are basically arguing that labor reforms is not the reason, or rigidity of labor reforms is not the reason for poor performance of the manufacturing in India. In fact, the reading that you're going to do next is by Achin Chakrabarti. He is also from this particular class, who coins a term called Futility Theory. and he also argues that the reforms that the people are doing, or the reforms that you're saying that will help, is not really going to help the Indian labor market. So their argument is that the problem does not lie in the labor reforms per se. So you can probably imagine that these are people from what tenor in political spectrum. ये लोग कहाँ से होंगे political spectrum में? ये लोग कहाँ से होंगे? राइट से, सेंटर से, लेफ्ट से? जो लोग कह रहे हैं कि लेबर रिफॉर्म जो है उससे कुछ फर्क नहीं पड़ेगा, यू शुड नॉट डू लेबर रिफॉर्म, दे आर प्रॉब्ली गोइंग टू से प्रोटेक्ट द लेबर इवन मोर. Left, exactly. These will be primarily center left, and people who are on the right side of the political spectrum which are going to probably oppose them, and that is what these guys also say, your Bhagwati and Panagariya. In fact, guys, if you see the US overall universities as well, they are divided into two parts. One is the salt water thought, and the other is the sweet water thought. The sweet water thought are basically all the universities which are probably more Keynesian in their process. So these are located near the ring, the finger lakes, something like a University of Chicago. So these are universities which are Keynesian in nature. And if you talk about the salt water industries which are on the Atlantic, all these universities are perhaps more classical. So read about this. This is another way of the kind of emergence that has happened in terms of economics, in terms of course. Then when we talk about the counter argument, so the counter argument is given by these neoliberals who have written this particular reading by Jagdish Bhagwati and Arvind Panagariya, and they say that they give a counter argument to the argument which is being given by the skepticals. Let's see this debate, and this debate is the most important part of this particular chapter. Now, let's see the first aspect. The first aspect which the skepticals say is that India has a huge population of unskilled people in the labor market, and there is a lack of literacy. And it is because of this lack of literacy that people that you do not have, you have a huge skill deficit. So that is the reason where you do not have a huge employment in the manufacturing. But the counter argument which is being given by Panagariya and Bhagwati is that the industries that we are talking about are not very skill intensive industries, are not very in terms of skill. You do not need a degree in physics, or a degree in mathematics, or a degree in engineering to produce toys, to produce electrical products. What you need is a small amount of training, a labor intensive manufacturing, and the work is also repetitive in nature. So it's not a very dynamic nature that people cannot learn. So the order of work in terms of cutting, sewing, stitching, packaging, all of this is a very so-called unskilled task. These are skill intensive, but in terms of the quantum of skill required, it's not very higher on that particular barometer. Therefore, they say that this can easily be done once it's taught to them. So it's based on repeated performance. And apart from that, even if you see the major education level, then the gross enrollment ratio in India has been rising in the last 15-20 odd years, especially after your midday meal program and then your Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan. So the basic level of education to run a sewing machine, to do that switching and cutting, all of these skills are prevalent and they're easy to learn. So this argument of lack of literacy cannot perhaps explain the lack of market in terms of labor, and it's not able to explain the poor performance. So this is another thing that is being discussed here. Then coming to the second argument given by the skepticals is that in China, which is a major manufacturing country, a lot of large firms hire females. Whereas because of the social institutions in India and the legal framework under the Factories Act 1958, females have probably been locked out of the Indian labor market. And that is the reason. It's not because of the labor laws, it's because of the defeminization of the labor market as vis-a-vis China. That is the reason for a poor performance in the labor market. Now, the counter argument. So guys, the reason that I'm saying this is a counter argument, actually, if you see your readings, this is being called as counter argument. This is being called as your counter argument. And this is actually a counter to the counter argument. So think of it in that way. So this is a counter argument and this is a counter to the counter argument. So think of this as counter argument 1. This is your counter argument 2. And this is the counter to the counter argument. What the authors say here is we can accept that fine. In Indian labor market, there is some amount of defeminization. But what about men? Why are men missing in the labor intensive markets? And even if the laws can be there, why cannot there be shifts in terms of manufacturing, that the women can work, and that happens in China, that women can probably work in the day shift and men can probably work in the evening shift? Why is that missing? So that is another. Then labor intensive, the third counter argument is that across the world, labor intensive products in a globalized world requires what is called as a concept called just in time. So you might have seen, guys, once you order on Amazon, you must have seen this, guys. So let me show it to you. Have you seen it, guys? When you post something, when you try to buy something, you get the estimated delivery time. Let me show it to you. You might have seen this. So if you try to buy anything, suppose inspired by your purchases. Okay, can you see here? There will be some place of delivery in 10 days. So it says that in how much time a delivery can be, delivery tomorrow. So this is the concept of just in time. You can actually measure that when a delivery is going to take place. So what the counter argument is? The counter argument is that in labor intensive products and in a globalized world where the manufacturer needs the cloth at a particular date, at a particular time, these concepts are not valid in India. The reason they are not valid in India is because the link between the factory and the port is huge, and there is huge infrastructural deficit. So because of poor missing infrastructure, there is poor manufacturing in India. To a certain extent, yes, the infrastructure in India is extremely poor in terms of both power, in terms of roads, in terms of waterways, in terms of railways. Yes, we are lacking behind. But at the same point of time, the counter to this counter argument by the authors say that there are certain states like Gujarat, like Maharashtra, like Tamil Nadu, which are having huge port facilities. The common underlying denominator under all these three states these are coastal states. They have a lot of good ports as well. A lot of these ports are also being operated by the private sector. So their infrastructure per se in these states is not relatively bad. So why is manufacturing missing in these states? To a certain extent, yes, the author accepts that infrastructure does play a major role in terms of manufacturing deficit, but what they are unable to explain, what the skeptics are unable to explain, is in these particular states, why is, despite the infrastructure being there, why is there a lack of manufacturing commensurate to the level of their state GDP? So that is another point that is being discussed. Then the fourth issue that the which is just being counter-argued by skeptics, is that to grow beyond a point, to grow beyond a level of growth, what you need is a higher growth, and higher access to credit. So because of the lack of access to credit that these smaller firms are unable to enlarge themselves. So in order to counter this counter argument, the authors say that if credit is being available to capital intensive industries like motor vehicles, which are inherently more riskier, then why would the banks discriminate just against the labor intensive industries? So banks are giving loan to people for buying motor vehicles. Banks are giving loan to automobile industry and to other industries as well. So why is that if a particular banking industry is giving loan to something like a automobile industry which is much more riskier, why would it not give loan to these smaller enterprises? To a certain extent, again, although this has not been argued in the reading, to a certain extent, yes, this is true, because these big enterprises in the automobile industry, they do have a lot of capital that they can put on lien, so they can mortgage a lot of assets. The problem in Indian manufacturing is that the small manufacturers have nothing to mortgage, so thereby you have something called as coming up as Mudra Bank, which gives collateral free loans. The focus is on collateral free loans. Then you have another argument, which is when a lot of business environment surveys are done. In all those business environment surveys, the manufacturers say that labor rigidity is not a problem. So when these surveys happen, most of these surveys say that labor rigidity is per se not a problem in the economy, and because it's not a problem in the economy, or they don't face labor rigidity as per se as a problem. Why is that? Why is that there is a huge fuss being made of labor market rigidity when the employers themselves are saying that this is not an issue in the business environment surveys? Now, the counter argument or the counter to this counter argument by the authors is that all these surveys suffer from what is called as a selection problem in economics. What you need to see is that where did you have this survey from? Where did you go for this survey? It's something like, suppose you were doing a survey of that because of COVID, was there a hit on your incomes or was there a hit on your consumption? And you only go to GK, or you only go to the posh colonies in Gurgaon and then start asking them questions that, sir or ma'am, did you have any kind of problems in terms of not being able to afford things? So basically that's the selection problem. If you have to do these surveys, you have to have equal representation from all stratas. So that's kind of a sampling problem, a sampling bias. So what these authors say is that these small size firms are overwhelmingly underrepresented in these surveys, and these surveys are based on large and mid cap firms, which are capital intensive firms. So capital intensive firm will not basically say that labor is a problem, because it's using more capital per worker. They probably need one worker for handling 10 particular machines. So for them, worker is not an issue, which is why these labor surveys, these business environment surveys, don't actually reflect the correct picture on the ground. Then apart from that, service firms are not, this idea is not applicable to service firms, people in the service industry. Then coming to the next argument that is being presented, the sixth argument. The sixth argument is, and this is an argument which is probably extended to all our laws, is that even if these laws are there, even these 200 laws are there, for 50 of them from the central government and 150 of them from the state government, The issue in India is that these laws are not enforced, and the Indian entrepreneurs are smart enough to know their way around these laws. So even though India has one of the toughest laws, and India has one of the toughest laws in terms of it's even if it's traffic laws or in terms of its labor laws, what it's saying is that the labor inspectors are pretty pliable. The administrative system in India is pretty corrupt for the manufacturers to get around these laws. So basically, bribing their ways out of these labor laws. Now, the counter to this argument given by the authors is that compare this to the pre 1991 era. In the pre 1991 era as well, the manufacturers knew that how to get their way around the industrial licensing system. But the problem is that there is a cost of compliance. There are two situations. One is that you have a liberal law. The other situation is that you do not that you have a strict law, but you have to get your way around it. So comparing these two situations, a much more easier situation for an entrepreneur would be of a no tension situation whereby the laws should be liberal. And if there are laws, then what happens is there are disputes, and if there are disputes, then there are judicial delays, and then the judiciary gets overburdened as well, and there is perversive incentive for the employer to hire more workers. So what essentially the authors are trying to say is that more laws and these strict laws rather than liberal laws are basically giving rise to litigation. Litigation is basically a term where you have a judicial dispute, and it's increasing the cost of compliance for the Indian. Then the last point is that the skeptics say that the labor market size of the formal sector is just 8%, and the informal sector is 92 to 93%. You can probably change it to 10% and 90% now, given the periodic labor force survey 2017 that we just saw. So what the skeptics are saying is that because we have an overwhelming informal sector, hiring and firing of contractual labor should not be an issue. Labor market per se should not give a problem to the entrepreneur, because most of the people who are working are in the informal sector, and you can easily regulate them. The formal sector is a very small sector. The counter to this counter argument given by the authors is that it is the labor laws which are the very reasons for this informalization. So they are saying that this 90% is because of these labor laws. If you ease these labor laws, this 90% will come down. So what you're trying to say is that you're trying to reason out that you can easily hire, and the labor market is not that rigid. But the authors are saying the informalization of the labor market is because of these labor laws, and therefore you need to change these labor laws. So this is what is being discussed. Then you can probably take a note from the Economic Survey 2018-2019 Volume 1 that the difference in labor laws in terms of flexible states which are flexible with their labor laws, and states which are inflexible with their labor laws. You can probably add this to your answers and probably earn those brownie points. So the Economic Survey 2018-2019 has a chapter dedicated to these labor laws and the analysis of MSMEs. So MSMEs and labor laws. Now, so what the Economic Survey in a sense talks about is that the difference in labor laws is a significant factor in explaining the number of MSMEs in the state. If a state has flexible laws, then the number of the number of firms will be much more than if it has inflexible laws. You can probably write this particular statement. And what needs to be done is that these 4 labor codes are being discussed. So in the last part of your answer, you need to mention that the government is already on its way to implement these 4 labor codes. Fine. Then probably you can go through these two particular cases. One is the Uttam Nakate case of 1983. It's from a company called Benz and Bharat Benz, and this is the case that I was talking to you about. That this case was decided in 2007, I guess, and a person who was retrenched in 1983 for lack of productivity because sleeping on the shop floor was reinstated in 2007 and with full wages after so many years of litigation. So just read that case. It's an interesting case too. I think Bharat Benz was the company. Bharat Forge, guys. Bharat Forge was the company. So let me now show you the reading, guys, what we have covered. So this is the area that we had covered today. That why the skeptics of adverse impact of labor laws are wrong. These are the points given. I have already marked them. So the first point of counter argument is that there is a skill deficit, and the counter to that counter argument is that the GER is increasing, and learning by doing, you can easily master these small tasks. Then the second counter argument is the large scale factories of labor sector industries in China, whereas in India the social attitudes and the employment in women is not very conducive, and the labor force participation rate of labor force participation rate of women is pretty low in India. Now the counter argument to that is why not men working more, and why can't there be shifts in terms of night shifts and day shifts. Then the counter argument, the third counter argument of just-in-time delivery that we had talked about, and India is not reliable in case of just-in-time delivery. But the counter argument that is counter to that counter argument is that Gujarat has good ports, Gujarat has good infrastructure, Tamil Nadu has a good one, Maharashtra has a good one. Why is that these particular states have not been able to do justice? Then the fourth argument that we talk about is the lack of credit, and the counter to that counter argument is that both medium and large firms, which account for a lot of employment, and they are riskier business. Why would banks discriminate in favor of the latter? So why would banks give more money to the automobile industry or the capital intensive good industry rather than labor good intensive industry? Then in terms of the survey, guys, we discussed about what is the selection problem. The surveys talk about that rarely these firms are telling that labor market rigidities is a key problem, whereas what we have is a selection problem whereby mid and large firms are overly represented in these surveys, and these small firms are not a part of these surveys. And a lot of these surveys are also built on service firms which are not on whom these labor laws do not apply. Then coming to the sixth argument, that going around these laws, that these laws are not enforced, but the problem is the cost of due diligence with respect to these laws, the overburden of judiciary with respect to these laws, and the case that I just discussed, Uttam Nakate case, and this was a case in say 1983, where this person was sleeping in the factory, and then the original then this case was decided by the Supreme Court in 2005, and again he was reinstated. Okay. So getting around these laws was a very costly affair for a company by the name of Bharat Forge. Then the last argument is that these labor laws only apply to a very tiny segment of the labor force, which is just 10%. 90% of the labor force is out of all these laws. But this is a disingenuous argument, where the reason that we have huge number of very micro enterprises is because of these laws, and because of the operation of labor laws on these particular in terms of, because of the prevalence of these labor laws, people have not been able to move from the informal and organized sector to the formal one. So that all is being done, and then you have these codes, what needs to be done, protection of firms. Just go through this, dispute settlement, and change in work profile. You should what should be done basically to get rid of all these things. First we need to do all these reforms, labor reforms. Then strikes is a major issue. Strikes should be banned, or at least wildcat strikes should be banned. You should be able to regulate. Then the IDA puts a heavy burden on the employer. That is being tackled by the labor codes. So labor codes is one part of the solution that you're going to explain. And apart from that, what you can also probably mention, so labor codes, majorly labor codes, what the government is already doing, and the issue of strikes, and then probably alternate dispute redressal mechanisms for if there is an issue between the employer and the employee. Okay, so this finishes our reading, guys. This is the most voluminous of your reading. What we need to cover now is the reading by Achin Chakrabarty. Now, as I told you, Achin Chakrabarty is again one of the skeptics who argues that reforming states, there are certain states which have been able to reform their labor market, and he's arguing that states that have been able to reform their labor markets have not seen much progress. So he's kind of reflecting on the futility. Let me just give you an overview of this reading. We'll finish it up on Thursday, but you need to understand what the futility theory is. Now, the futility theory is that in order, I mean, you can probably read these 3 lines. That will give you a good idea. The futility theory, the futility argument is to establish that it will be wrong to claim that such reforms would be able to achieve what the advocates of the reform expect them to achieve, given the reality of the Indian labor market. So what Achin Chakrabarty is saying is that given how the Indian labor market is, given the characteristics of the Indian labor market, whatever reforms that what these states are doing are going to be insufficient, are going to fall short of what is needed. So it also argues that there are inherent reasons, there are inherent logics why Indian labor markets do not clear. We'll talk about something called as an insider-outsider model, which you might have covered in macro guys. Insider-outsider model of wage rigidity basically comes under your new Keynesians. There is a school of thought called new Keynesians. Suna? Yes or no, guys? Have you heard of new Keynesian thought? किसने नहीं सुना? New Keynesian thought. Insider-outsider model, efficient wage efficiency model. So basically all these models try to explain. Now, can someone tell me the basic crux between your classicals and your Keynesians?
Sir, classical believe that free market is the best way to organize any economic activity. But when the Great Depression happened, the theory of classicals wasn't working because they believed that the market would restore itself, but it could not. So then the Keynesian economist theory became famous that government should intervene and help market restore the equilibrium. So, but then post that the new classicals came, and so yeah, that's how the theories evolved.
The theory has, Aditi, you're to a very large extent, you are correct. But the theory also is about the clearance of markets. So the classicals believe when you talk about classicals, then you talk about new classicals. Both of them are trying to suggest that how the markets will clear automatically. Whereas the major thorn between the classicals and the Keynesians is that the Keynesians, whether you talk about the classical Keynesians or you talk about the early Keynesians or the modern Keynesians, or so called as the new Keynesian thought, all of them say that why the market will not clear. So it depends on the expectations again. So there is a thought process which is also called rational expectations. So the new classicals were revived on the basis of those classical the rational expectation models. You might have heard about a model called as the Lucas model. Suna? Lucas models, and then you might have also heard about rational expectations. So all of these models were revival of the classical thought that an economic agent will be able to perceive the monetary policy and the fiscal policy, and it's only these unexpected shocks which will shift the economy. Whereas the Keynesians now have argued towards the new classicals and said that no, look, we can have rigidities in the market, and that those rigidities can explain why the markets will not clear. And when we say the markets will not clear, we basically mean that the labor market will not clear. There will be certain amount of involuntary unemployment. Whereas the classicals will always suggest that how employment will turn to full employment or the potential employment. So these are the thought process with which these two groups work, and we will explain in this particular reading that how despite of all these measures that these guys take or these measures that these states take, we will still have prevalence of what is called as informal or not informal, your involuntary unemployment, which is because of something called as an insider-outsider model or wage efficiency model. So you might not have done that in macro, but probably I'll give you a small idea about it through wage setting curves, which is not being discussed in detail here, but if you see the class notes, you will probably get an idea about it. Last year when I taught this, I think I had taught them about the wage setting insider-outsider model as well. So on Thursday, guys, we'll be covering our course in terms of this particular reading, and with this we will wrap up our first unit. The other two readings I'll just ask Garima to cover it up. Last year also she covered these two readings. So we'll be over with a major chunk of the course, and from next week onwards we'll start with agrarian. With that in each particular class you can expect that we'll be able to finish one particular reading, and after this all your readings have already been recorded, so I'll put them on my website as well. So all you need to do, just in case you miss a class, you can probably go through the last year's reading or last year's recording, and that will give you a good summary of what we had discussed. Okay, let me pause the recording.